This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everybody. This is Brianna Whitney, host of the True Crime Arizona podcast, and this is an update from the Zombie Hunter trial, week 2.
I'm Morgan Lowe, and I've been in the courtroom watching and listening during the first 2 weeks of testimony.
Now, there were only 2 days of court this week, but they were powerhouse days. So, Morgan, why don't you describe the mood in the courtroom as new people took the stand this week, and what was the big takeaway from these past 2 days?
So prosecutors are continuing to hammer away at their case here. That Bryan Miller is the canal killer and that he murdered these 2 women in a most heinous way. And what we heard was some really, really graphic testimony from a medical examiner who described the injuries to Melanie Bernas and how she died. And so that started the week on a really, really sort of somber note. And then we went into some fairly interesting testimony about how they caught Bryan Miller. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. And that sort of changed the pace. And then we heard from a victim.
Yeah, so this is interesting. This is somebody that we've been waiting to hear from too. But one of the witnesses that testified during week 2 is a woman named Celeste Bentley. She was Bryan Miller's first victim. And we can say first victim because he was already convicted of attacking her. And it happened back in 1989 when Miller was just a teenager. Celeste took the stand and told the court about that morning back in May of 1989 when she was taking a city bus to her job at the Paradise Valley Mall. She worked at a department store called Mervyn's, and she said she noticed that someone had followed her off the bus. Before she knew it, she said she felt like someone hit her from behind. And here's how she described this in court.
When I reached back, I grabbed my back and then I pulled my hand close in front of me because it was wet, and I looked and I saw the blood, and I had known that he had stabbed me.
Once you saw blood on your hand, what did you do?
I just started screaming and running towards my work. I was yelling, I've just been stabbed, that guy just stabbed me.
Did you learn what the person's name was that stabbed you?
Yes.
What was the name?
Bryan Patrick Miller.
So what's interesting, too, about this attack is Celeste described Bryan, or the person who did it to her, running off. And while she was waiting to be taken to the hospital in the ambulance, police brought a man or a teen to her and said, "Is this the person who attacked you?" And she said, yes, without a doubt, yes. That person was Bryan Patrick Miller, and he was wearing a different outfit at that point. He had changed his clothes. And they asked Celeste in court, did you feel any pressure to make a positive identification, like to get somebody, under arrest to identify the person that did this? And she said, I didn't feel any pressure. Even with the change of outfit, I knew it was him. I recognized him. I saw him. He also got off the bus. I was sure it was him. And then later in the trial for that, the court proceedings is when she learned his name as Bryan Patrick Miller.
Yeah, and so that went pretty quickly. And because Bryan Miller was still under the age of 18, he was tried as a juvenile, and he spent a little less than a year in a juvenile detention facility. But then he was done. He was out. At that point, he was an adult, and that record was, at the time, sealed because he was a juvenile. That was 1989, and the first canal killing took place in 1992. So he gets out of juvenile custody, and 2 years later, prosecutors say he killed Angela Brosso at that point.
And then Melanie in 93. And I think what it seems like the point of having Celeste come and testify like this, why is this so important for the state's argument that Bryan did this? Well, this establishes a pattern of violence that began when he was younger and began before Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas were killed. And I think that's something they're trying to hammer home to the judge.
Yeah, they want to show that this was a pattern. The first week they introduced what they called the plan, which is he had come up with this idea of how he was going to identify a teenage girl, kidnap her, attacker and killer, and they think that, or they're trying to make the argument that this was the first step in taking that plan out. According to the police report, what he told one of his friends after this, and they said, "Why did you do it?" He said he wanted to see what it felt like. That was in the police report. Pretty interesting hearing him, even though, we have to assume that that was what he said. But in the report, he said that, and that's a little bit of an insight, if you believe the report, into what was going through his mind.
Right. Now, we also heard testimony from the Phoenix police detective who came up with the plan to get DNA from Bryan Patrick Miller. We're going to pivot to that part of the investigation here. Now, Morgan, this is super interesting, I think, because this is a whole undercover operation. I mean, when you think of the movies and, we got to get somebody's DNA secretly from the cup they're drinking at the restaurant, it's very cinematic, but this is actually how it went down. So you were in the courtroom, you were listening to the testimony from that detective. What did he say? How did this plan be put into fruition to get Bryan Patrick Miller's DNA?
Yeah, and we've been listening to a week and a half of testimony that has been very methodical, very sort of just A, B, C, and then we get to this testimony and we hear there's a plot. There's a narrative. And so at this point in the investigation, a genetic genealogist had come up with information that the Phoenix Canal killer was someone with the last name of Miller. And Phoenix police had a Bryan Patrick Miller on their master list of investigative leads. Now, these investigative leads, these were people who investigators were tracking down one by one to get DNA samples from. And that was important because the Canal killer sexually assaulted his victims, and police were able to get his DNA that way. They had that DNA, but they didn't have a match for it. So this detective who is testifying, his name is Clark Schwarzkopf, he tells the court about how he was surveilling Bryan Miller, hoping to see him throw away a soda can or something they could get a DNA sample from. And after 3 days of this, they had nothing. So Schwarzkopf thinks there has to be a better way.
We had been doing surveillance based on some information that we had acquired about Mr. Miller. And we'd been doing it for almost 3 days. And I decided we hadn't found what we were looking for, which is something discarded to possibly get a DNA sample off of. So I approached Mr. Miller in the parking lot and talked to him.
What parking lot was that?
That was where he worked. At the point he was employed at Amazon on the west side.
Tell us about the conversation that occurred.
So I'd noticed that there were some office buildings, actually a warehouse north of where he parked, and he spent his time at his breaks, all of his breaks, parked in a position where he could see those buildings. So I came up with an idea that I would recruit Mr. Miller as a security person. I told him that we were out there doing security on that particular office complex, warehouse, and that there had been some thefts from it. And I asked him if he'd ever seen anybody back there, and he'd said, yeah, there's been some vans in and out of that place. So I told him, I said, we were trying to do it, but trying to do the surveillance, but frankly, we didn't want to do it anymore, and if he'd be interested in working for us as a security guard, watching that particular warehouse from the back.
And what was his response?
He said yes, and I told him that we'd pay him for his time, and that I would meet with him later and get an employment application filled out, and then discuss more about the job later.
So where do they decide to meet? Well, they agreed to meet at a Chili's restaurant. That's the plan. That's where they're going to meet. And that's when things unfold from there.
Yeah, so this is where you get the sort of spy versus spy. So Phoenix police set up the scene at this Chili's restaurant. They talked to the restaurant ahead of time. They had a booth that was pretty much wiped down, cleaned out. They came to the restaurant, the detectives, with their own silverware, their own plates and glass. Everything had been sanitized because they wanted to get this DNA sample. So Schwarzkopf meets Miller and Miller's daughter at this restaurant. They sit down at the booth and they start talking, shooting the bull, talking about this supposed job. And they order, and the food comes and everything on the plates that had been sanitized. And when the conversation's over, Schwarzkopf walks out with Miller and all these detectives who were also in the restaurant. And we learn later that the restaurant had several other Phoenix PD detectives, because although at this point Miller was just an investigative lead, they knew that he had a violent past, and they knew that he was being looked at as a potential suspect in this case. So they were there to sort of ensure the safety of Schwarzkopf and the other people and keep an eye on what was going on. So Schwarzkopf leaves with Miller, the other detectives go and they take the samples. And it was like 2 days later that the match comes in, and they knew that this was the guy.
And I remember when I went to interview Colleen Fitzpatrick, the genetic genealogist who first found that name Miller, I love her soundbite from this moment, because she had honestly some negative attention with doubters to, will genetic genealogy even work in a forensic setting? I mean, how is this a thing? You know, it was new at the time. And she remembers getting the call from the lab, and they said, "You were right, Miller. It's a match to Bryan Patrick Miller." And at that moment, she goes, "Oh my God, they got him." And it was that moment where she knew her work made such a big difference in this case. A real pivotal moment, honestly, for genetic genealogy as a technology to help solve crimes, too.
Yeah, so they picked him up 2 days later, and he was in court that day getting his initial appearance. And then they... in court, they talked a little bit about the sort of disaster that his house was like. He was a hoarder, and it was just junk from floor to ceiling and that kind of thing. But that description of how they decided to come up with this plan to get his DNA, because at that point, he was a person of interest. He was not a suspect. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they felt like they had enough to be able to go to a judge and say, we have probable cause to take his DNA for a search warrant. So reasonable suspicion, they had to just get it. And that was a legal issue that's been going on in court. The defense is saying that Miller had a Fourth Amendment right to privacy, to right from unreasonable search and seizure, and a right to privacy. And they're trying to get this evidence excluded. The judge has on multiple occasions ruled in favor of the prosecution, saying that the defense didn't meet their burden and this DNA evidence is admissible. And that is the DNA that linked him to the murders, and it's the linchpin of their case.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have the DNA, this is a totally different case. The fact that it was a direct match like that, this is exactly what the state is arguing. And we should point out, too, that arrest happened at the beginning of 2015. So this has been a long saga to get to this point, the trial. Bryan Patrick Miller's been behind bars that whole time, too. Just a lot of delays. You had the COVID delays, and you had all these different motions that were filed. Finally, we get to this point where the trial happens. So that was really one of the more interesting parts of this week, too. But we also heard some additional graphic testimony about those injuries to Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. But this is interesting. The defense introduced their own forensic witness, a medical examiner that they hired to go over the autopsies and maybe come up with some alternative observations about the injuries and how and when the victims died. Here's a clip from the testimony of Dr. Jonathan Arden.
Either of these women would have been unconscious within 30 seconds. It could have been less time, but just to be conservative here, let's say inside of 30 seconds, they either would have been unconscious. And given that rate of blood loss, somewhere in the range between 1 and 2 minutes would be more than sufficient time to have caused lethal blood loss. So I think they both would have been unconscious in about 30 seconds or less, and I think they both would have been dead somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 minutes after being stabbed.
So, Morgan, why do you think the defense is trying to establish that the victims died quickly? I mean, they died either way. So why is timing such a factor here?
Yeah, this is a really important point of contention because this is a death penalty case. The prosecution needs to establish that the defendant committed this offense in an especially heinous, cruel, or depraved manner under Arizona law. So if Miller is found guilty and it goes to the penalty phase, all of this is going to go to the fact that, did the victims suffer? Did they feel fear? Were they aware of what was going on? So the prosecution spent days explaining the terrible injuries that the victims suffered, and the defense brought in this attorney who basically said they were unconscious within 30 seconds and were probably dead within a minute or two. So in the penalty phase, the defense attorneys will say the victims didn't suffer. They didn't. I know they're cut up. I know he did this to them, but they didn't suffer. It's a very gruesome argument, but it is a distinction with a difference, and that could make a difference in the penalty phase. The attorneys are going to be arguing about this for the rest of the trial.
And that's so crazy to think about it like that. Obviously, legally, this makes sense as to why each side is arguing their points. But there was such a point made that all of these cuts, a lot of the stab wounds, the cross in the chest and all the stabbing across the neck, all of that happened post-mortem. And obviously that's the defense's point, that this, they didn't feel a lot of those. But God, when you're thinking about the brutality of that and why somebody would go so much farther after they're already dead to cut them up like that, it almost makes it more monstrous. It feels like that.
To a regular person,
Yes.
absolutely. But under the law, there is a difference. So the prosecutors have tried to make as much of a case that we're not really sure which injuries were inflicted post-mortem or while the victims were alive. This was the first medical examiner, medical expert who came in and really sort of said definitively he believed that these injuries were done post-mortem. We've heard from 2 previous medical examiners who could not or would not give that definitive, judgment there. So that is going to be, something that they argue about.
And that is a blurry area. I mean, can anybody really prove exactly when they died?
I'm not an expert here, but I've been sitting through this court and a couple of the little points that they made that, cuts that are made when someone is alive bleed more than
Right.
cuts that are made after, blood is not moving through the body. So that's one of the ways they're able to tell. But with Melanie Bernas, she was underwater. And so everything was washed out. And so the prosecution's medical examiner, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy, said they couldn't really tell which incisions were post-mortem because everything had been washed out. This person who came and was hired by the defense was a lot more definitive. The cuts, the stab wounds to their backs were what killed them, and it would have caused them to die or become unconscious within 30 seconds and die within 2 minutes. He was definitive. Nobody else was.
Interesting. So the trial's now on recess for 2 weeks because one of the attorneys had a scheduled trip a long time ago. That's something we don't normally see when there's a jury and people are having to stop their own lives to be there. But of course, in this case, they're just arguing for the judge. Morgan, what do you expect to come when trial picks back up? I mean, what are the pieces that we're still waiting to hear from or about involved in this case?
It looks like we're going to start right back in with the prosecution talking about the DNA evidence, what linked Miller to these murders, and then it's going to go right to the defense. And what they're going to do is talk about not guilty by reason of insanity. And it looks like they're going to spend their entire time arguing about his mental state, making the case that he could not appreciate what he did or was not aware that what he did was wrong. Whatever law they're going to need to go by, because the murders, as you've said before, happened so long ago, the law that governs insanity at that point is what they're going to try to meet the burden of.
And is that a different set of standards than it is now in 2022?
It's a little bit of a gray area. Arizona's not guilty by reason of insanity law is a little different from most states, and it hasn't been in place here for all that long. So I'm going to assume that the standards in the 1990s were a little different. To a regular person, it's probably not going to be that different. You know, if you hear the two definitions, legally, there's probably some differentiation that they're going to have to abide by here.
And I wonder if that will change any sort of outcome, whether that's how long he spends somewhere or something like that, something we just won't know.
Whatever the case, it's a very high bar that the defense is going to have to prove. It is a difficult argument to make because otherwise, most people who murder a person or a couple of people, and it's not in the commission of a robbery or in the heat of passion, there's an argument that most of those other murders are committed by someone who is insane. But that doesn't mean that they're not legally responsible and will have to legally pay the price. So the bar is pretty high.
I'm assuming we'll hear from doctors, psychologists, mental health experts, somebody who can testify about that?
Yeah, leading up to the trial, there's been a lot of argument back and forth about which psychological experts are going to be allowed to testify and what they're going to be allowed to say. I'm assuming there are going to be a lot of objections from the prosecutors in this testimony because it's going to be the defense case and it's going to be their witnesses saying, we believe that he was not responsible for his own actions.
Even though they're his actions.
Right.
That's where it gets crazy. There's a whole lot more that's obviously to come in this trial. Because of the recess, you probably won't hear from us again until the trial resumes at the end of October, but we will be back to bring you the very latest as more people take the stand and as the Zombie Hunter trial continues. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney.
And me, Morgan Lowe. It is a production of 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.